Good Moed, Moedim L'Simcha. Hope you all had a beautiful first days of Yom Tov. We are on Mem Amud Beis. We have two Amudim to catch up on. We're just going to do one at a time. So Mem Amud Beis, if you're in the article 40b3. Ein nostin kemach lesoch charoses. You're not allowed to add flour to charoses. Now charoses to us means one thing. In the time of the Mishnah, charoses just meant a dip, a vinegar dip. It was a vinaigrette, I guess, which they added flour to. So you're not allowed to add flour to this dip with vinegar. O lesoch chardal, nor are you allowed to add flour to mustard on Pesach. And if you did, yachel miyad. The Tanna Kama says you have to eat it immediately. In other words, it's not chametz, but it could very quickly turn into chametz, and therefore you have to eat it immediately. Rabbi Meir Oser Meir says you are not allowed to eat it at all. You're not allowed to cook the Pesach, the Korban Pesach, lo b'mashkin, nor not in liquids, v'lo b'meiperos, nor in fruit juices. You are allowed to baste a Pesach with a Korban Pesach with these liquids, with fruit juice or other liquids, or dip it into it, but you're not allowed to cook the Korban Pesach. We'll see if there's an actual prohibition against cooking the Korban Pesach, which we'll see soon. Finally, the Mishnah has one last halacha about chametz, and it says me tashmisho shel nachtum, the water used by bakers. So if you are a baker, what you would do is you're constantly putting your hands into water that have like a bowl full of water. So nowadays they probably clean that out every day, or maybe every few hours. Back in the day, they would just have like one bucket, and they keep on putting their hands in yeshafchu. So it has to be poured out to because the flour that's on the baker's hands could ultimately become leaven. Okay, the Gemara is going to analyze different parts of this Mishnah. Amar Kana, machlokes l'socha chardal. That the Mishnah said that you cannot add flour to charoses or to mustard. He says, and then Rameir, then it says if you did, you have to eat it immediately. Rameir says you can't. You have to burn it right away. You can't eat it at all. You have to burn it right away. That machlokes, that debate, is only l'socha chardal. It's only about the second ingredient, about mixing flour into mustard. Aval l'socha charoses, when it comes to charoses, to be called Yisrael, everyone would agree. The charoses, if you mix flour into charoses, again, charoses, not our charoses, but charoses meaning a vinegar mixture, vinegar dip, everyone agree you have to burn it immediately. We have a brisa which supports this. You're not allowed to add flour to charoses. If you did add flour to the charoses, it must be burnt immediately. If you added flour to mustard, or Meir says you have to burn it, it must be eaten immediately. So you see that this brisa says they're only arguing about mustard, but when it comes to adding flour into charoses, everyone would agree you have to burn it immediately. Amar Rav Huna B'Rei Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Shmuel, halacha k'divrei chachamim. Okay, so we have Rav Huna, this is Rav Yehuda saying in the name of Rav, Nachman saying in the name of Shmuel. The halacha follows the opinion of the chachamim. When we say chachamim, we mean the anonymous opinion in the Mishnah, which says that it should not be done, but if it's done, it's eaten immediately. Okay, Amar Rav Nachman Yitzchak, Rav Huna B'Rei Rav Yehuda, Rav Nachman Yitzchak responds to him and says, we're now on 41a1, Mem Aleph Man Aleph, Acharoses Kamar. Are you referring to charoses or Achardal Kamar, or are you referring to mustard? Amar Le, Rav Huna responded to Rav Nachman, L'may nafkamina, what's the difference? Meaning, why are you asking this question? What's the difference? If charoses, mustard, it's the same thing. By asking what's the difference, right, he's basically saying, there's no difference. If I said the halacha is like the chachamim, it would be the halacha by the chacham for both. So Gemara says no. What the difference is, Rav Nachman explains, Lid Rav Kahana, for what Rav Kahana just explained to us. Dam Rav Kahana machlokles l'soch chachardal. Rav Kahana says the dispute between the Tanna Kama and Rameir is only about mustard. Of l'soch charoses. When it comes to charoses, to be called Yisrael, everyone would agree it should be burnt immediately. So what he was trying to clarify, when you Rav Nachman said the halacha is like the chachamim, were you saying the halacha? Were you agreeing to Rav Kahana's distinction, his qualifier, that he said that the Mishnah should not be understood that the chachamim, meaning the Tanna Kama and Rameir, are arguing about both cases? They're only arguing about the case of mustard, but they would agree about charoses, or are you disagreeing with Kahana? So Amar Le, Rav Huna says to Rav Nachman, Lo Shmieli, I never heard of Kahana. Kilomar, as if to say, Lo Svirli, I do not agree with it. Right? So what he's doing over here is like a polite way of saying, I don't agree, right? If you call like the Starkey and you ask them about a hechsher, and they say, oh, we're not sure, we don't have information about that, that really means it's a bad hechsher, right? In other words, it's just their polite way of saying, no. So that's what's going on over here. When Rav Nachman, Rav Huna says to Rav Nachman, I never heard it, he's saying, I don't agree to Rav Kahana's distinction. Okay, I'm Rav Ashi, Kivas Rav Kahana mistaper. Even though Rav Huna rejects Rav Kahana's distinction, Rav Ashi wants to actually substantiate or prove Rav Kahana's approach, again, who makes this distinction, saying that when it comes to vinegar, everyone agrees. Why? Amar Shmuel ein halacha Rav Yossi. Shmuel says the halacha is not like Rav Yossi. Now, which Rav Yossi? We had Rav Yossi a few days ago, which said that if you have grain that touched water, you put it over vinegar, and vinegar prevents it from leavening. Okay, but the halacha Shmuel says is not like Rabbi Yossi. My love to Musi Hudilot Zamis. When we say the halacha is not like him, that means that vinegar does not contract, it does not hold it back. Ha chamui mechamta, but it does actually promote it meaning it not only, we're saying that it doesn't contract the swollen grain, but it actually makes it leaven. In other words, that's why the halacha is not like Rav Yossi, in the sense that he's wrong. Not only does vinegar not cause it to contract and not leaven, but also it actually makes it more leaven. The Gemara says low, and therefore, what's the point? The point is that the fact that we know that halacha is not like Rav Yossi must mean that we hold vinegar actually enhances or promotes or expedites the leavening process, and therefore the fact that Shmuel says the halacha is not like Rav Yossi, that means that vinegar is something which acts on, makes chametz quickly, and therefore what comes out is, Rav Kahana, who said that their machlokas is only about mustard and not by vinegar. Why? Because he holds vinegar is something which the process of leavening goes very quickly. So Gemara says, lo, the fact that Shmuel says halacha is not like Rav Yossi is not necessarily a proof. Dilma lot mitzmas tzamis v'lo chamuich mechama. Why, by rejecting Rav Yossi, all we're saying is it doesn't cause it to contract, but it doesn't necessarily promote leavening either. Okay, now the Gemara moves on to the second part of the Mishnah, which spoke about the Korban Pesach, and it said, again, you're not allowed to cook the Korban Pesach in liquids or in fruit juices. Tanur Banan. Ba'mayim. Pasuk says you shouldn't cook the Korban Pesach in water. Ainli el b'mayim. Had you just had the pasuk read it simply, you can't cook it in water. Shar mashkim minayin. How do you know about other liquids? In other words, the Torah only says explicitly you shouldn't cook it in water. Amos kal v'chomer. So the Tanakama, the first opinion over here, is saying it to Kal V'chomer. Uma mayim she'em mefigin taman, water which does not impart flavor to the meat, right? If you cook something in water, the water doesn't have its own flavor, it's flavorless, right? Asur, nonetheless, it's forbidden. Sharmashkin she'mefigin taman, other liquids like, this juice or that juice or barbecue sauce, you're going to boil it in this sauce, in a liquid, which it's going to impart flavor. So for sure that's going to be a problem. Like Kol Shekain, for certainly it should be an issue. So that's how the first Tana learns the source for prohibiting cooking the Korban Pesach in any other liquid. Rabbi disagrees, not fundamentally. We'll see there's some small debate. He agrees you can't cook it in any other liquid, but his source is different. He says, Bamaim, the pasuk says that you are not allowed to cook it in water. Ainli elamayim. From there I only see that you can't cook it in water. Sharmashkim minayin. How do you know you can't cook it in any other liquid? Tamalomer, uvashel mevushal. The pasuk has a double terminology, cooked. You cannot cook it, mikol makom, meaning any circumstance of cooking is forbidden. My benayu, what's the difference between them? Ika benayu, tzli kedar, basically pot roast, okay? So, what that means is as follows. According to the Tanakama, the issue is something which imparts flavor. And therefore, if I go ahead, so cooking in water, can't do it. Any other liquid, I can't do it. But let's say I put it in a pot, and I don't add any other liquids, but it's sitting in its own, the Korban Pesach is sitting in its own liquid, okay? So the Tanakama would say, the first approach would say, okay, there's no problem. There's no other flavor involved, and there's not water involved, and therefore it's okay. According to Rebbe says no, bashal mevushal means any type of cooking, and therefore, even if it's in its own juice, it would be forbidden. Okay, that's machlokas between them. We don't have the Korban Pesach, tragically, right now, but there is a minhag, there's a well-known minhag that we don't have roasted food on Pesach night, and many people are careful not even to have a pot roast. In other words, if you're going to have something which has its gravy and other things added to it, that's one thing, but just to have it in itself without any sauces at all, that is something that should be avoided. Okay, Rabbanan, what do the rabbis, what do the Tanakama do with the words Bashal Mevushal, my Avdilei? What do they do with the words Bashal Mevushal, that double terminology? We need it for the following brisa: Bishlav Achach Slow. If a person cooks the Korban Pesach and then roasts it, Oshid Slov Achach, we're at 41a2, Oshid Slov Achach Bishlo, or if it's roasted and then cooked, Chayv, you're going to be liable for the prohibition of you should not eat it cooked. Okay, so the Bashal Mevushal says that whether it's cooked and then roasted and cooked, either we're going to be chayiv. Ask the Gemara, Bishlam Bishlo Achach Slow. I understand if you went ahead and cooked it and then you roasted chayiv, habashla, because once you cooked it, it's cooked, and therefore roasting it after doesn't take away its cookedness. I know that's not a word. But if you go ahead and you roast it and then you cook it, hatzli eshu. At the end of the day, it was roasted, and the first impression, the first interaction this meat had with heat is roasting, and therefore it's roasted. So the fact that you cooked it after shouldn't impact it. Am I? What's the problem? So Rav Kahana Hamani, who is the author of this brisa, who says that cooking after roasting actually is going to impact or retract or erase the original roasting, it's Rav Yossi. Rav Yossi Hidetani, we have a brisa that says the following halacha: Yotzin berkik hasharoi, a person can fulfill their obligation to eat matzah with a wafer of matzah that was soaked, umevushal shalonimach, or with one that was boiled, as long as it was not dissolved. Divrei Meir. Okay, that's Rav Meir's opinion. Rav Meir says you can have matzah with a wafer of matzah that was soaked, or with one that was boiled, as long as it wasn't boiled to the extent that it gets dissolved. Rav Yossi Omer, and here's the Rav Yossi we want: Yotzin berkik hasharoi, you can fulfill your obligation to eat matzah with a wafer that was soaked. Avalo bevushal af bishlonimach. You can't, once you cook it, it's going to be problematic. Why? Because you need to have matzah. Matzah is baked. So what's the problem if it gets cooked? Clearly, Rav Yossi holds that the cooking process in some way upends the baking process originally, and therefore, similarly over here, the fact that it was roasted first, once it was cooked afterwards, like Rav Yossi would hold, that the cooking afterwards erases the original roasting, and that's why Rav Kana wants to say that our Mishnah, that brisa, is the author of the brisa is Rav Yossi, and it says Ula Amar Fil Tim Rameir. You could really say our brisa that says that you cannot go ahead and cook it after roasting. It's also problematic. Even it could even be Rameir who said that cooking the matzah is not problematic. Okay, why? Shani hacha, here it's different regarding the Korban Pesach, because the pasuk says again that double terminology, you cannot cook it, teaching you that any form of cooking. So really, once if you roast something and then you cook it in another context, we'd still consider it to be roasted. And if you bake something and then you cook it, Rameir would say it's still considered baked and it's still considered matzah. When it comes to Korban Pesach, since it says uvashal mavushal, saying any type of cooking, therefore it's going to be forbidden, even though you roasted it first. Worth mentioning, just parenthetically, and that is that we do not soak our matzah in water. You're supposed to eat matzah dry. However, it's worth noting that if someone is ill, if someone is elderly or ill, whatever, and they can't eat matzah properly, they are allowed to soak it in water as long as it doesn't get dissolved. You'd be allowed to do so and then eat the matzah. Taner Rabbanan, we have a brisa on top of 41A2, second column. Yachol tzlo kol tzarko. You could have thought that if a person burnt the Korban Pesach, kol tzarko over in this context, as we'll see, means you charred it, okay? It's completely burnt, yichayev, you'd be chayev. In other words, that's not considered roasted. Tamalomar, al tochel menu na uvash mavushal mayim, na uvusha, the pasuk says, don't eat it partially roasted or cooked in water, na uvash mavushal amar tzlecha, v'loshit tzlo kol tzarko. What's forbidden is partially roasted or cooked, but if you overdid it, that's not a problem. That's not a problem. You shouldn't do it, but it's not a problem. Hey chidami, what does that mean? You rendered it charred, okay? So again, you shouldn't. You should be careful to make sure that your Korban Pesach comes out good, but if it was overdone, it's still, you're not going to be chayiv. Taner Rabbanan. V'braisa, speaking about a Korban Pesach that was not cooked at all. Yachol achol k'zayis chayiv. You may have thought that if you eat a Korban Pesach raw, you've shech the animal, you slaughtered the animal, and then you eat it raw, you'd be liable. Tamalomer al tochlu mimenu na uvashal mavushal. You should not eat it partially roasted or cooked. No, vashal amar t'lechad. Pasuk says you can't eat it partially roasted or cooked, lochai, but it doesn't include raw. Yachle mutter. Some you may think that you actually fulfill your obligation. Tamalomer kim sli. No, it has to be eaten roasted. So you don't necessarily. You're not in transgression of a prohibition, but that's not the way to eat your Korban Pesach. Now, what is the definition of partially roasted? Amarav kidamri parsai abarnim. The Persians have a type of meat called abarnim. That type of meat is partially roasted meat, and that is not meat that is okay for Korban Pesach. It has to be fully roasted. Amrav Chisda mevashel b'cham mitveri b'Shabbos patur. If a person cooks something in the hot springs of Tveria, meaning any hot springs on Shabbos, you are not liable. Pesach shebishel b'cham mitveri chayiv. If you cooked your Korban Pesach in the hot springs of Tveria, you are going to be liable. That is called cooking. Ask the Gemara, Ma'ishna b'Shabbos delo. Why is it when it comes to Shabbos that that you're not going to be in violation of the prohibition against cooking, to told us Ishbin and Veleka, because in order to be chayev for Shabbos, has to be either fire or derivative of fire, and Chamei Tveria, any hot springs, that's not a derivative of fire, that's heated by the ground, by the sun, whatever it is, but it's not coming from a fire. Pesach Nami, Lav Taldos Eshu. So with the Korban Pesach as well, why are you going to be chayev? Why are you going to be considered, the Gemara says, by Korban Pesach also, at the end of the day, since it's not a derivative of fire, therefore you shouldn't be liable for eating Korban Pesach that was cooked in it. So our answers, Amarava, Mai Chayv Diktani, what does it mean when it says you're liable? It doesn't mean that you cooked it, right? Again, there's a few prohibitions going on. One, it says you have to make sure you eat it cooked, okay? So that is saying that that's a positive commandment. We're going to come back and analyze this commandment the next year, but then it also says don't cook it and don't eat it partially roasted. So the Gemara initially thought that when we said you're going to be chayiv over here, it means that you're in violation of cooking it. We're saying no, you're right, it's not cooking. Since you cooked it by the hot water of Tveria, that's not cooking, but rather what you're in violation of is the positive commandment of eating it roasted. You did not fulfill that when you cooked it in the Chamei Tveria, because at the end of the day, cooked is cooked. There's another version of this conversation which is explicit. A person goes ahead and cooks something in the hot springs of Tveria on Shabbos, you are not liable. When it comes to cooking in the hot springs of Tveria, you are going to be liable. Doesn't mean you're going to be chayav for cooking, but rather for cooking your Korban Pesach, but rather because the Torah says has to be eaten roasted by fire, and cooking it in any substance, or even if it's water that is not a derivative of water heated, but not through a derivative of fire, nonetheless that is still considered not roasted by fire, and therefore you are in violation of not eating a roasted Korban Pesach. We'll pick up shortly.